The knock on my door came at 7:14 in the morning, and I remember the time exactly because I was standing at the stove with a spatula in my hand, flipping eggs for one, the way I had every morning since my husband passed. When I opened the door, it wasn't a neighbor. It was a man in a gray suit holding a manila envelope, and behind him, parked crooked at the curb like he didn't care who saw it, was my son's car. "Margaret Doyle?" the man asked. "That's me. You've been served." He held out the envelope, and for a moment I just looked at it, because some part of me already knew, before I even opened it, that my life was about to split into a before and an after. I took it. He nodded once, the way people do when they've done something uncomfortable enough times that it no longer bothers them, and walked back to his car. I stood in my doorway in my robe and slippers, the eggs burning behind me, and read the words at the top of the page: "Petition for appointment of conservator." Below that, in the section marked "Petitioner," was a name I had carried inside my body for 34 years. My son, Ryan Michael Doyle. He was petitioning the court to have me declared incompetent. He wanted control of my finances, my property, and buried in paragraph 14, in language so clinical it took my breath away, the family restaurant my late husband and I had built from nothing 40 years ago. The restaurant where Ryan had learned to walk between the tables. The restaurant that still had his height marked in pencil on the doorframe of the storage room, going back to when he was 4 years old. I sat down at my kitchen table with the eggs still smoking on the stove, and I read that petition 3 times before I let myself cry. If you've made it this far, and this story has already caught your attention, let me know where you're watching from. Tell me your city and your country in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening from tonight. My name is Margaret Doyle. Everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 61 years old, and until that morning in October, I believed I knew exactly who my son was. I want to back up, because you won't understand how a mother ends up sitting across a courtroom from her own child unless you understand how we got there, and it didn't happen in a single day. It happened in 1,000 small ones. The way a house doesn't collapse from one crack, but from years of water finding the same weak spot over and over until one day the whole wall gives way. My husband, Tom, and I opened Doyle's Kitchen in 1986 in a strip of buildings on Route 9 outside a small town in Ohio that most people driving through wouldn't remember the name of. We had nothing then. A used deep fryer, a bank loan that terrified us both, and a dream that felt almost embarrassing to say out loud. Tom cooked. I ran the front of house, the books, the people. We raised Ryan in the back booth of that restaurant, doing his homework between the dinner rush and closing, falling asleep some nights with his cheek against a stack of napkins. Tom died 6 years ago. Heart attack, sudden, no warning, gone before the ambulance even reached the hospital. I kept the restaurant open because closing it felt like losing him twice. Ryan told everyone how proud he was of me for doing that. He told everyone a lot of things. What he didn't tell people was that 2 years ago, he asked to borrow $80,000 to invest in a friend's real estate venture. I gave it to him, not loaned. Gave. Because that's what you do for your child. Or at least, that's what I believed back then. The venture failed within a year. He never mentioned paying it back, and I never asked, because I told myself that's what the money I'd worked my whole life for was for. For him. For his future. I didn't know, at the time, that he'd also taken out 2 credit cards in my name, small ones. He'd tell me later, just for emergencies. Never used past the point of paying utility bills he and Danielle couldn't cover some months. I didn't know his marriage had turned into a slow, cold war over money they didn't have, and a lifestyle they couldn't afford, a house 2 sizes too big for their income, a leased SUV Danielle had insisted on, vacations posted online that were paid for with a card they were still paying off a year later. I used to see the photos and feel proud, the way a mother does, never once wondering how any of it was possible on a mid-level marketing salary and a part-time real estate license Danielle rarely used. Looking back, there were signs. Ryan stopped calling just to talk somewhere around the 3rd year of his marriage. When he called after that, it was almost always because something was needed, a favor, an opinion he'd already decided to ignore. Or, twice, money. He stopped bringing the grandkids by the restaurant on weekends, the way he used to. And when I asked why, he said Danielle thought it was better for their routine if they stayed home. I told myself families just change shape as children grew. I didn't let myself consider that the shape was closing me out on purpose. I didn't know that 6 months before that envelope landed in my hands, Ryan had sat down with a lawyer named Grant Sabo, a man with a reputation, I would later learn, for making elderly clients' families cry in hallways, and started building a case that his own mother was no longer fit to run her own life. I didn't know Sabo had told him, in that very first meeting, that the fastest path to conservatorship wasn't proving I was dangerous or cruel. It was proving I was merely forgetful, confused, a little slower than I used to be. Small things, stacked high enough, could look like a mountain to a judge who'd never met me before that morning. The petition claimed I had documented memory lapses. It claimed I had made irrational financial decisions inconsistent with prior behavior. It cited, as evidence, the $80,000 I had given him, twisted now into proof that I couldn't be trusted with my own money. It cited a night 4 months earlier when I'd forgotten where I'd parked at the grocery store, something that had happened to me exactly once in 61 years, and which I had laughed about at the time with the teenager helping me load my trunk, not realizing my own son was standing 3 aisles away, phone out, quietly writing it down, like evidence at a crime scene. It even cited a comment I'd made at a birthday dinner, half joking about how tired I'd been feeling lately, turned, in the petition, into a clinical-sounding line about reported fatigue and diminished capacity for self-care. Reading it, I understood that someone had been watching me for months, cataloging me, waiting. I called Ryan that afternoon. He didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. I texted him one line. I got the papers. Please call me. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, 3 separate times, before his response finally came through. This isn't personal, Mom. It's for your own good. We'll talk about it in court. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after that, in the quiet of a house that had never felt so large or so empty, and I understood something with a clarity that frightened me. My son believed he had already won. I hired a lawyer of my own, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, who'd been recommended by a regular customer whose divorce she'd handled years earlier. When I told her the details, laid the whole ugly shape of it out on her desk, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've never forgotten. Mrs. Doyle, I need you to understand. Conservatorship cases like this are winnable by the petitioner more often than people think. Judges see a confident son, a nervous mother, a stack of cherry-picked incidents, and sometimes that's enough. We need to be ready to fight for every inch. For the next 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives. In one, I still opened Doyle's kitchen every morning at 6, still greeted the regulars by name, still ran the register with hands that had never once shaken, still balanced the books on Sunday nights the way I had for 4 decades without a single audit ever finding so much as $1 out of place. In the other, I sat in Priya's office answering questions designed to determine whether I still deserved to be treated as a full and capable human being. I want you to understand something, Priya told me during one of those sessions, sliding a legal pad across the desk. This isn't really about whether you're competent. Everyone in that courtroom, deep down, will probably believe you are. This is about whether we can make the story he's telling fall apart faster than he can build it. Juries and judges don't run on facts alone, Mrs. Doyle. They run on narrative. Right now, his narrative is devoted son, worried about his aging mother. Ours has to be the truth, but the truth needs a shape too, or it gets lost. I underwent a cognitive evaluation with a court-appointed psychologist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Whitfield, who asked me to remember 3 words, then draw a clock, then count backward from 100 by 7s, then describe, in detail, how I managed the restaurant's payroll, inventory, and tax filings questions that took nearly 2 hours in total. I did it all without a single mistake, and still, driving home afterward, I cried the whole way, because the fact that I'd had to prove it at all felt like its own kind of grief. There is a particular loneliness in sitting across from a stranger, defending the shape of your own mind to a man who will decide, on a form, whether you still count as fully yourself. I tried once, during those 6 weeks, to reach Ryan directly, not through lawyers, not through paperwork, just mother to son. I drove to his house on a Tuesday evening and sat in his driveway for 10 minutes before I found the nerve to knock. Danielle answered. She didn't invite me in. He's not comfortable talking outside of counsel right now, Maggie, she said, using my first name the way she always had, though it landed differently that night, colder, more like a door closing than a greeting. Behind her, down the hallway, I heard Ryan's voice telling one of the kids to go finish their homework, and I understood, standing there on a porch that used to feel like my own family's porch, that I would not be getting past that threshold. I left a grocery bag of his favorite cookies on the step, the way I used to when he was in college, and drove home in silence. Ryan, meanwhile, was building his case with the confidence of a man who had never once imagined losing. He had witnessed as a cousin who swore I'd repeated a story twice at Thanksgiving, a former waitress at the restaurant, fired 2 years earlier for stealing from the register, who was more than happy to testify that I'd become erratic in my management style. He had Danielle, dressed in soft, sympathetic colors, ready to tell the court how worried the family was about me. He had Grant Sabo, sharp-suited and smooth-voiced, who I watched shake my son's hand in the courthouse hallway like they'd already scheduled the celebration dinner, both of them laughing at something too quietly for me to hear, as though the outcome of my life were already a settled joke between them. The morning of the first hearing, I stood outside the county courthouse in a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I watched my son walk past me without so much as a glance, his lawyer's hand on his shoulder, laughing at something, as though this were nothing more than a business meeting he intended to close. I want to tell you I felt only anger. I didn't. Underneath the anger was something worse, the quiet, terrible fear that maybe, somewhere in that courtroom, 12 strangers and one judge would look at the story he'd built and believe it more than they believed me. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, with a flag drooping slightly in the corner and a clock on the back wall that ticked loud enough to hear during the silences. I sat beside Priya at one table. Ryan sat beside Grant Sabo at the other, not once turning to look at me. Danielle sat in the gallery behind him, her hands folded primly in her lap. We waited almost 20 minutes past our scheduled time. Finally, the bailiff called the room to order, and a side door opened. All rise. The Honorable Judge Alan Reyes presiding. I stood with the room, my heart hammering, my eyes on the man walking to the bench. He was younger than I expected for a judge, early 50s, maybe, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that looked like it had done a great deal of living before it settled into stillness. He sat, arranged his papers, and then, in the way judges do at the start of a case, glanced down at the file to confirm the names in front of him. This is the matter of the petition for conservatorship. Ryan Doyle petitioning regarding Margaret Doyle. He looked up. Is Margaret Doyle present? I am, Your Honor, I said, rising slightly. He looked at me then, really looked, the way you look at someone when a name has just done something strange to the room in your memory. His eyes moved from my face to the papers in front of him and back again. Margaret Doyle, he repeated, slower this time, of Doyle's Kitchen on Route 9? Priya glanced at me, surprised. I nodded. My voice caught somewhere in my throat. Yes, Your Honor. That's my restaurant. Something shifted in his expression, not the practiced neutrality of a judge managing a courtroom, but something private, something that belonged to a much older version of the man sitting on that bench. He set down his pen. I'm going to need a brief recess before we begin, he said. 15 minutes. Across the room, I watched Ryan lean toward his lawyer, whispering something with a small, confused frown. Grant Sabo shrugged, unbothered, checking his watch like a man who had all the time in the world. I had no idea, in that moment, why the judge's face had changed the way it had. I only knew that for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt something other than dread. When the courtroom reconvened, Judge Reyes didn't return to the bench right away. Instead, the bailiff informed both counsel that the judge wanted a brief conference in chambers, myself included, along with Ryan, before formal proceedings resumed. Priya looked as uncertain as I felt, but she nodded, and we followed the bailiff down a narrow hallway to a modest office lined with law books and a single framed photograph on the desk of a boy standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. Judge Reyes stood when we entered. He wasn't wearing his robe now, just a white shirt and tie. And without the elevated bench between us, he looked less like an authority and more like a man working something out in real time. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "do you remember a boy named Alan? 1991. You would have been running the restaurant maybe 5 years by then." I searched his face, and slowly, impossibly, something in my memory shifted into place. A boy, 14 years old, thin as a fence post, who used to sit alone in the back booth of Doyle's kitchen for hours after school because he had nowhere else to go. His father was gone. His mother worked 2 jobs and came home too exhausted, too broken by her own troubles, to notice her son slipping further and further into trouble with a rough crowd from the next town over. "Alan," I whispered. "Alan Reyes. I used to sit in that back booth because it was the only place in town that felt safe," he said, his voice quieter now, less judge and more man. "You never charged me for the food I couldn't pay for. You told everyone I was doing homework for you, some made-up job, so I'd have a reason to be there and a reason to eat. You talked to my mother when the school wanted to put me in a program for at-risk kids. You told the county I had somewhere stable to be after school, so they wouldn't take me from her. You never once made me feel like charity." I remembered it now in fuller color, how frightened and proud he'd been. How I'd quietly told the cook to always make his plate a little heavier than the ticket said. How I'd sat with his mother in a booth after closing one night, holding her hand while she cried about failing her own son, and told her she wasn't failing anyone, that some seasons were just harder than others, and that Alan was going to be all right because I could see it in him even then, something steady underneath all that fear. "You told me I was going to make something of myself one day," he said. "I didn't believe you. Nobody had ever said that to me and meant it." "You did make something of yourself," I said, my eyes burning. "Look at you." Ryan stood in the corner of that office, utterly silent, watching a version of his mother he had never once bothered to ask about, a woman with a whole life of quiet kindness stretching out behind her, long before he was old enough to remember any of it. "I want to be very clear," Judge Reyes said, turning to address the room formally now, though his eyes lingered on me a moment longer than necessary. "I am not recusing myself from a sense of personal debt. I'm telling you both, on the record, because fairness requires transparency. I will hear this case exactly as I would hear any other, on the facts and the law alone. But I wanted you to understand, Mr. Doyle, exactly whose life you are asking this court to take control of." The hearing that followed was nothing like the one Ryan had walked in expecting. Grant Sabo called his witnesses one by one, confident and unhurried, clearly having rehearsed each of them into a rhythm he expected would carry the day. The fired waitress went first, describing me as confused with the schedule sometimes, and short-tempered in ways she hadn't been before. But under Priya's cross-examination, her composure slipped fast. She admitted, reluctantly, that she'd been terminated 2 years earlier for repeated cash discrepancies at closing, discrepancies that, when Priya read the termination letter into the record, totaled just under $3,000. She admitted she'd applied for unemployment afterward and been denied on the grounds of cause. She admitted, when pressed, that she'd reached out to Ryan herself, through a mutual friend, after hearing, through the grapevine, that he was building a case not the other way around. "So you volunteered to testify against a woman who fired you for taking money that wasn't yours," Priya said, "in a case being brought by her son." "I just told the truth," the woman said, though her voice had gone thin by then, and nobody in that room, including the judge, seemed to believe her anymore. The cousin came next, a nervous, well-meaning woman named Carol, who clearly hadn't expected to be sitting under oath in a wood-paneled courtroom over a Thanksgiving dinner conversation. She testified that I had told the same story about a trip to Myrtle Beach twice within the same hour. Evidence, she believed, of exactly the kind of memory lapse the petition described. Priya, patient and unhurried, produced 2 sets of photographs I'd shared with the family over the previous 2 years, one dated from a trip to Myrtle Beach 3 summers ago, and a second, entirely separate trip to a different beach town in Delaware the following year, which Carol, under gentle questioning, admitted she had simply confused in her own memory. "So it's possible," Priya said, "that the memory lapse in that room wasn't Mrs. Doyle's." Carol didn't answer that directly. She didn't have to. I watched her face fall, watched her glance toward Ryan with something like an apology already forming, and I felt, for the first time since that envelope arrived on my porch, something loosened in my chest. Dr. Whitfield, the court-appointed psychologist, testified plainly that I had scored in the fully normal range on every cognitive measure administered, that my performance was, in his words, unremarkable in every respect except its consistency, and that nothing in his 2-hour evaluation supported the claims in the petition. Under cross-examination from Sabo, who tried twice to suggest the results could still be an early or masked presentation of decline, Whitfield simply shook his head. "I've evaluated hundreds of patients," he said. "I don't guess at conditions that aren't there because a lawyer would prefer that I did." Then it was Ryan's turn to testify. And this is the part of the story that still, even now, makes something in my chest ache. Priya asked him directly about the $80,000. "You told the court this was evidence of your mother's irrational financial decision-making," she said. "Isn't it true that you asked her for that money?" Ryan hesitated. "Yes. Isn't it true that you told her it was a safe investment, guaranteed by a friend of yours, and that she gave it to you because she trusted you?" Another hesitation, longer this time. "Yes. And isn't it true that when that investment failed, you never repaid a single dollar of it, and instead, 6 months later, began building a legal case that used that very same gift as proof your mother was no longer competent to manage her own finances?" The courtroom was silent, except for the loud, steady ticking of that clock on the back wall. I watched my son's jaw tighten, watched something crack behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with the fact that, for the first time in this whole ordeal, he was being forced to hear his own actions spoken back to him in someone else's voice. "I thought I was protecting the family," he said finally, quietly. "Danielle and I were struggling. The restaurant is worth something. I told myself Mom couldn't run it forever. And if I didn't step in, we'd lose everything when she got older and things got complicated. I told myself it was for her own good." "Was it?" Priya asked. "Or was it for yours?" He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room, including him, already knew. Judge Reyes did not rule from the bench that day. He took the matter under advisement, which Priya told me was standard, though I spent the following week in a fog of exhaustion, unable to fully trust that this nightmare was actually ending. When we returned to the courtroom 8 days later, Judge Reyes read his decision in a clear, measured voice that filled the whole room. "The petition for conservatorship is denied in full," he said. "The evidence presented by the petitioner does not meet even the lowest threshold required by law. Mrs. Doyle demonstrates full cognitive capacity, sound judgment, and a consistent, decades-long record of responsible financial and personal decision-making. What this court has instead observed is a petition built substantially on a son's financial dependency on his mother, followed by an attempt to reframe her generosity as her incompetence when that dependency became inconvenient to acknowledge." He looked at Ryan then, not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who had once been a frightened boy in the back booth of a restaurant, watching a woman choose kindness when she had no obligation to offer it. "I would encourage you, Mr. Doyle, to spend less time in courtrooms and more time at your mother's table, while you still have the chance to sit at it." I don't remember standing up. I remember Priya's hand on my shoulder, and I remember, across the room, Ryan finally turning to look at me, really look at me for the first time in 6 weeks. His face wasn't triumphant, the way it had been walking into that courthouse the first morning. It was small, young, ashamed. He didn't approach me in the courtroom. He didn't approach me in the hallway either. It took him 4 more days to knock on my door. And when he did, he stood on my porch the way that gray-suited process server had stood there months earlier, except this time, he wasn't holding an envelope. He was holding nothing at all, just his own 2 empty hands and a face that had finally run out of reasons to explain himself. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "You don't fix 34 years in one conversation," I told him. "But you can start." I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table the way he used to as a boy, elbows too wide for the space, shoulders hunched like he was bracing for something. He told me things that day I hadn't known: how deep the debt with Danielle really ran, how frightened he'd been of losing the house, how Sabo had made the whole thing sound almost reasonable in that first meeting, a clean legal solution to a problem he didn't know how else to solve. He told me he'd rehearsed an apology in his car twice before he found the courage to knock, and both times had driven away without getting out. I kept telling myself, It wasn't really about the money, he said. But it was. I just didn't want to be the kind of man who'd do that to his mother for money. So I built a story where it wasn't that at all. I didn't forgive him all at once. And I told him so. Trust isn't returned the way a borrowed dish is returned. Whole and in one piece. Apologized for at the door. It comes back slowly, meal by meal, Sunday by Sunday. The way it's built the first time, I made 2 plates of eggs, the way I had every morning since Tom died. Except this time there were 2 chairs pulled up to the table instead of 1. And for the first time in longer than I want to admit, the silence between us didn't feel like distance. It felt like the beginning of something we still had time to repair. I still open Doyle's kitchen every morning at 6. The restaurant is still mine, every booth, every table, every pencil mark on that storage room doorframe. And somewhere across town, in a courthouse I hope never to walk into again, there's a judge who still remembers exactly which back booth used to be his, and a boy sitting in it, learning that kindness, once given freely, has a way of finding its way home when you least expect it and when you need it most.